Chrysalis Autry was her name. And frankly, she really wasn't in that great of a mood when she walked into the bridal salon of San Antonio 2 days after Thanksgiving. On that day, she met the shop's owner. Her name was Amy Wells. You see, just a couple nights earlier on Thanksgiving night, after a house full of relatives had said goodbye, her father Jack was rushed to the hospital. You see, a few months earlier, he'd received a diagnosis of aggressive melanoma. But that next day from his hospital bed, he insisted that Chrysalis keep her appointment to try on wedding gowns that next day with her mother. Her future mother-in-law and other relatives also were visiting from Houston, and so they went and they did this even though their minds and their hearts were back there at the hospital room with Dad. 10 dresses later, Chrysalis settled on the perfect dress. Amy Wells, that shop owner, agreed that this dress was just right. But Chrysalis told Wells that she couldn't buy the gown right then and there. In fact, she couldn't even put a down payment on it. Her father was in the hospital, terribly ill, and the family needed to hold on to all the money that they had because they were uncertain of what was going to be ahead. And as they told Amy Wells about the dire condition of things, Amy, that store owner, realized it was very likely that father was never going to see Chrysalis come down the aisle in that dress. She says that at that moment she felt the nudge of the Holy Spirit. And so she said to Chrysalis, and I quote, "Take this gown and veil to the hospital and wear it for your daddy right now. I insist." Chrysalis fell into Wells' arms crying. She called her mom into the dressing room, told her what was happening, and she started crying. And Amy packed up that gown and hugged Chrysalis goodbye. No credit card number was taken. No down payment was exchanged. In fact, she said she didn't even know the young woman's last name and didn't even ask for a phone number. Chrysalis remembered asking Wells, "What if we get the dress dirty?" To which Amy Wells replied, "It's a piece of fabric." Chrysalis got her brother to bring a video camera to the hospital. When they arrived, her dad was heavily sedated, but the family was able to wake him up in time to see Chrysalis walk into his room. He was able to stay alert for about 20 seconds. But in the words of Chrysalis, those 20 seconds were magical. My daddy saw me wearing the most beautiful dress. He was really weak. He smiled and just kept looking at me. I held his hand, and he held mine. He had always called me princess, so I asked him if I looked like a princess. He nodded yes. He looked at me a little more, almost as if he was going to cry. Then he went back to sleep. 3 days later, Jack died. What brings a Christian bridal shop owner to provide such a moment in the life of a complete stranger? The answer, it is grace. It is a generosity that can develop inside of the lives of all of those, if you were with us last week, if you'll let me borrow the term, who find ourselves soaked in the grace of God. Something that develops inside of us, and I say the word develops, into true generosity because of grace. It is more than just random acts of giving. Any of us can do that. Be stirred in the moment by a picture, be touched by a circumstance, and randomly do something good. But generosity goes deeper. Generosity develops in the lives of those who have let God's grace wash over them. Today, let me take a huge risk with you. Because the truth is I believe most of us consider ourselves generous. And so if I dare to preach a sermon to you for the next 20 or 30 minutes that says how we need to develop generosity, you might be willing to ask, are you saying there's a problem? To which my answer to you is, yes, there is. Because we are not by human nature generous. It's not our natural default position. In fact, frankly, left to our own devices, we're just flat out selfish. Selfishness is the most inherent sinful characteristic in every one of us. Birth a set of twins and see if they'll grow up always preferring the other. Watch a circumstance and see if people spend their life and the effort chasing down the good of someone else. You see, selfishness doesn't have to be taught to us, it's inherent. If you don't believe you are bent towards self-interest, then I would like to ask you a question. The last time you were standing in a long grocery line and you suddenly discovered that another line was opening up, was your first thought, oh good, someone else will get out of here more quickly? Our natural thought is, won't this be good for me? Today, I want us to look at a scripture that is the antithesis, the absolute opposite of our natural carnal nature that watches out for self and shows us what it looks like when we become a people of generous grace. It's a story of tragedy and triumph, of despair and love, a story of loss and yet hope, a story where a mother-in-law plays a major role, and so I know all about it. It's a story, a great story. The backstory, if you were listening as the scripture was read, is Elimelech and his wife Naomi leave Israel along with their 2 sons. They travel to Moab because there is great famine and crop failure in their own area. Just when they thought things might get better, Naomi's husband died. And just when Naomi thought things couldn't get any worse, both of her sons died, leaving a huddle of 3 widows. Tragedy striking. As a result, Scripture clearly tells us that Naomi becomes bitter. Understandably so. She decides there's no sense in her being a widow in a foreign land to starve and die there. At least she thinks, I can go home and starve and die amongst my own people in Israel. So she decides to go home. Her 2 daughter-in-laws say, we'll go with you. Now you need to remember, these 2 daughter-in-laws are Moabite. They're not from Israel. Eventually one, Orpah, turns back, but not Naomi. And I want us to look at how this goes down. This can only take place because Ruth has come to know the God of Israel. She says, your God? Oh, he'll be my God. And she becomes an example of grace thousands of years in advance of when Christ will come and teach us all about God's grace. And so let me show you what that looks like, that it might begin to develop more in us. The first is this. People who are filled with generous grace see others. They see others. Ruth doesn't stop to say, oh no, what are my needs? Ruth doesn't stop and say, the most driving force in my life right now must be self-preservation or self-interest. She's moved by a greater need in front of her than ever before. Now let me tell you a few things. When Ruth goes back to Israel, she won't be the belle of the ball. Israelites hate Moabites. When she goes back to Israel, she's going to be subject to a whole lot of how many Moabite women does it take to screw in a light bulb type jokes. In fact, some of the history is this. The Moabite people come around, they begin as a result of the incestuous relationship between Lot and his daughter. Moabite women also were known historically in Israel as being the ones who, when the Israelites were traveling through the desert going to the promised land, they came out and seduced some of the Israelite men and God punished them. And many died as a result of that seduction. And so at great personal risk and cost, Ruth allows herself to be burdened for Naomi. Ruth honestly recognizes Israel may not be so great for me, but this decision is not about me. You see, people who are generous discover there are times in life when God just calls us to something and it's not about us. It's about something bigger than us. Only those who carry on with generous grace can live their lives that way. To be transformed from natural takers to intentional givers, we have to be able to see others. That's how Jesus did it. Oh, and by the way, if you say, what can we do, Pastor Todd? If we've been born takers, we've been born takers. That's okay. You can be born takers, but you can be born again as givers. You see, I fear that we too easily in this nation fall trapped to what I will call the consumption assumption. It's not original with me, but the process sure is true for so many of us, and it's this. Everything in my life, everything that comes to me is for me. We think that so often. Well, God blessed me with this. Must be because He wants me to have more of that. Well, God just expanded this. Must be because this much more is for me, and I'm going to enjoy that much more of a blessing from Him. Suddenly, we can undo the consumption assumption when we begin to say, God, why have you so extravagantly poured your grace out on me? Is it for someone and something bigger than just me? William Booth, you've heard me mention before, was the founder of the Salvation Army. He was supposed to make a speech at a conference to many of his leaders, but he took sick. And so they said, can you at least send a note to encourage our leaders? And so he sent a note, and he said, if you'll read this note to the people, it is a summation of what I was going to say to my leaders. And so they took this note, they opened it expecting some kind of long handwritten missive, and when they opened it up, it was just one word. It said, others. In the same way, we need to constantly say, God, open my eyes up to something broader than my little self-contained world. I have discovered, I'm humbled to confess this, but I have discovered that it is possible to wake up in the morning and go 16 to 18 waking hours in a day and really predominantly only think about me and my needs and my desires and my plans and what's ahead for my day. And go back to bed that night and realize I have spent virtually no time worrying about grace for others. Speaking of getting out of bed, I remember when Diane and I were newly married and we were in college together, and she always was an early riser anyhow. She would go over and practice her saxophone, and it was sacred time to her. But for a period of time, she stopped doing that. Still climbing out of bed just as early, but instead of going over to play saxophone, she was headed to the gym. And I said, what are you doing? And she said, well, I'm walking with my friend Lois. One day I went over and found Diane and Lois walking together. Lois was morbidly obese and could barely make her way around that track with any pace at all. I knew my wife could probably circle the track literally 3 or 4 times in the amount of time it would take Lois to go around that track one time, but my wife walked one slow step at a time, building a relationship with Lois, and was giving up the first hour of her day being mindful of exactly what William Booth said. Others. We've got to be able to see others. Secondly, we serve others. Naomi saw more than just herself. Ruth saw more than just herself, I should say. And so she went back with Naomi to Israel. But then when she was there, she didn't say, well, I'm here. That's enough, isn't it? She actually served her. Moved by her mother-in-law's plight, she realized there was only one thing she could do to make a difference. Look what it says. She said, let me go to the fields and pick up the leftover grain behind anyone in whose eyes I find favor. And Naomi said, go ahead, my daughter. So she went out and began to glean the fields behind the harvesters. As it turned out, she found herself working in a field belonging to Boaz, who was from the clan of Elimelech. In that day, it was actually built into the Hebrew law that when they plowed their land and brought up their harvest, they had to leave the edges of the field for those who were destitute. Just a little bit of the droppings and the fall-offs that they might be able to somehow survive by gleaning the edges of the field. And that is difficult, back-breaking, heat of the day work. In fact, we will find out later in the book of Ruth, if you read it through, that it was actually extremely dangerous for her to be out there in these circumstances and situations, but she went. She did one of the very few things that a widow could possibly do to take action, to make a difference, not only in her own life, but in the life of her mother-in-law. She didn't just see the plight of others. It wasn't just that her heart was moved. She jumped in and said, if someone's going to do something, it's going to be me. She rolled up her sleeves and said, I can make a difference. I wonder, do we ever stop to see opportunity as sacred, as God placed in our lives to be generous to someone else, to take an action that will be a blessing, that will meet a need, that will cover a bill, that will step in a gap? See it as sacred? God's implemented guidance to us to live with generous grace. You know, serving is often a long haul. And sometimes people that we're serving and God has burdened us with won't make it easy. And we may begin to say, you know what, I was going to do that for them, but they're not grateful enough. They're not trying hard enough, or they're not this, or they're not that. And we might say, you know what, I feel like I've signed up for more than I just thought. You know, look at what she dealt with. It says in verse 20 that her mother-in-law said to this, don't call me Naomi. It's not my name anymore. Call me Mara, because the Lord Almighty has made my life very, what's the word? Bitter. You know, look, you're trying to help somebody, and they're so upset with how their life is going. They're like, let me tell you how bad it is for me. I'm going down tomorrow to the clerk of the court in St. Mary's County, and I'm changing my last name to Bitter. That's how bad things are for me. Do you think that person is easy to live with? You do understand there's a natural challenge to live with a mother-in-law anyhow. You do understand that, right? I'm just checking. I'm referring to yours, not mine. Yeah, I'm sure. Yeah. How difficult it is in life to be making a difference, and somebody is so hurt, they're so wounded, they're so bitter, they're so closed. But she served nonetheless, thankless, difficult work, not thinking anyone was seeing. But by the way, someone was. But we'll get to that at the end. And so we wake up and we see others, and then we become willing to serve others. Even to the point of this third thing, which is this: we can get to the point of carrying each other's burdens. It says Ruth gleaned in the field until evening. Then she threshed the barley she had gathered, right? So she's already worked sun up all the way till evening. Now she threshes the barley. She's going to go and work it so she can get the grain out of the stalks. It amounted to about an ephah. And she carried it back to town, and her mother-in-law saw how much she had gathered. Are you ready for this? She carried back the equivalent of 6 gallons of grain. That was because of the blessing of God. It was because of a man named Boaz, and we'll talk about him in just a minute. The man who had owned the field saw her gleaning and threshing and helped provide for her. Not a little grain, a whole lot of grain. Why? In Ruth's mind, it's so that Naomi can be blessed. In Ruth's mind, she'll carry 6 gallons of grain back. A back-breaking trick. She's going to carry someone else's burden. She's carrying what Naomi is going to eat, not just what she is going to eat. Today I want to take a minute and help us a little bit with this idea of carrying others' burdens. Because sometimes when we talk about generosity, we can become very confused about, well, when is God speaking to me? And when am I supposed to do stuff? And when am I supposed to help someone out? And when am I not supposed to help someone out? And those specific answers can only come to your heart from the Holy Spirit. But let me give you a concept. A better term would be a precept from the New Testament that will help you understand this idea of carrying burdens for each other. And it comes from Galatians chapter 6. Paul is writing, and I want you to see within a few verses these things he says. The first thing he says is this. Read it with me tonight. Carry each other's burdens, and in this way you will fulfill the law of Christ. You're like, okay, that sounds very much in line with what we're talking about. It's exactly what Ruth did. She carried someone else's burden. But you're like, so I'm still trying to figure out how that helps me know what burdens I should carry and what burdens I shouldn't. Just 2 verses later, look at what Paul says to them. He then says this. Read this with me. For each one should carry his own load. Like, well, now I'm a little bit confused because a minute ago, Paul just said we should carry each other's burdens. And now in this verse, he says each one should carry his own load. And the secret to understanding this is differentiating between burden and load. Let me illustrate it to you this way. What would happen if you began to observe that your neighbor's grass wasn't being cut? That for some reason this man who used to make sure he faithfully cut his lawn now is not cutting it, and the lawn is growing higher and higher and higher, and you're not sure if you should feel bad or be angry or what you should do about it? Folks, if what has happened is that this man has stopped cutting his lawn just because he's decided that he much more enjoys binge watching Netflix than mowing his lawn, then you need to sit down and have a conversation with them and say, you know what? Understand that this is your own load in life. You bought this house. It is your load, and it is a reasonable load. We all in this neighborhood expect to mow the lawn. So what I need to do to help get you inspired is that you'll cut your lawn, because that is your load. It is not expected of you that you would give your energy, your gas, your mower, your time to cut his lawn, because it's his own load. And he needs to be able to carry his own load in life. But maybe you go over and you knock on the door, and he answers. You say, hey, man, I've noticed that your lawn's kind of grown up. Is your mower broken, or what's going on? And he says, I am so sorry, and I feel so bad. I don't mean to be doing this in the neighborhood. But, you know, my wife and I, we just had a brand new baby, and she had a very difficult time giving birth to the baby, and the baby's in intensive care, and I'm trying to run the kids where they need to be and keep the house going, and mom's in the hospital, the baby's in the hospital. And suddenly you realize that what previously had been a load in his life has become what? A burden in his life. And suddenly you know what you say, right? You say, hey, you know what? Don't you worry about your lawn. I got a good tractor, and I got a 16-year-old son. No, you Someone say amen. You know what? You are under a heavy burden right now. And I am, according to Galatians 6, going to carry your burden for you. So I'm going to mow your lawn. I'm going to do that. And you know what? What else do you need? Can we double up and get your kids to ball practice because they're going to the same field we are? And what can we do? Because you have a burden that is too much for you to carry. So I want to carry it with you. You see? That's generous grace working in our lives. Sometimes God will call us to do that financially for somebody. What previously had just been a load for them, part of their responsibility, they negotiated for that mortgage, or they said they were going to buy it, or previously had just been a load, but suddenly there's a massive downturn at their work. It's not their fault. And suddenly what had just been a load is now a burden. And you see, if we just remember the consumption assumption? Well, all the money God gave me was for the things that I need to pay for. And suddenly generous grace breaks the consumption assumption, and suddenly we say, hey, my cousin, my neighbor, my friend, my acquaintance, my coworker is in a difficult time that's not of their own doing. And I've got to help them meet what they need to do. Why? Because the Bible says don't turn away from someone and say, tomorrow I'll help you, when it is in your ability to help them today. So when the Holy Spirit says to us, you can help carry that burden, then we just do it. You know, Ruth had no legal responsibility to provide for Naomi. There was nothing in the law that said if Ruth didn't, then she was in trouble. And there was really no one who would have looked down their nose at Ruth if she had just stayed in Moab. Made the most sense for her. But she chose to live up to the New Testament quality of grace thousands of years before Paul ever penned these words for us. It's not easy to carry others' burdens. We're busy ourselves. There's enough going on in our own lives. It's hard enough and taxing enough to pray for our own children, but God burdens us to pray for our friends' lost children. It's tough enough to meet our own needs, but suddenly God gives us someone else who's needy around us. But let me tell you something. While it may be hard to carry others' burdens, I want to tell you my observation. If you think I'm wrong, you can come see me later. My observation is this: generous people are the happiest people on the planet. They're the happiest people on the planet. And by the way, when I say generous, that is not a statement about how much money you make or how much spare money you have. A generous heart and a generous life finds ways to help one another bear burdens, and it's always not just about dollars. But people who have been bathed in the grace of God, who suddenly say, you know what? God is teaching me how to have generous grace in our life. They're the happiest people going. And I'll tell you one other thing that happens with generous people. They are very attractional. They become attractive to other people. Other people stand up and go, I don't know what it is, but when I'm around that person, I like being around them. It's not because they're running around bragging about how many lawns they mowed for somebody or how much money they give away. No, generous people don't do it for that reason. But there's just something about them. And let me tell you something. There was something about Ruth, and it caught the eye of a guy named Boaz. And that's why he said, you know that lady right there who's gleaning? He pulled all of his works and said, number one, none of you mess with her. You protect her. And two, I want you to start pulling out an awful lot of stalks right when she's behind you and just go, oops, look at that. That's how she ended up with all that blessing. Because there's something about generous people that is attractional. Well, let me tell you, Boaz liked that. He fell in love with Ruth even though she was a foreigner. And he married her. And there's something special that goes on in our lives when God helps us to be generous. You know, Jesus said an interesting thing we can find in Matthew chapter 6, verses 21. He said this, where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. Now, I think that is one of those sentences that is true whether you put A before B or B before A. I think you could say where your heart is, it's where you'll put your treasure. I think you could easily read that. But that's not actually even the original way it reads, is it? Read it with me. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. Is it possible that remember we said today, we are learning how to be more generous? Is it possible that in hearing God's voice say, put your treasure there, put your treasure there, put your treasure there, that as we obey Him, He begins to develop in us a heart that learns how to chase after that kind of generosity and learns how to do that because we simply, by force of habit, have said, God, I'm going to do what is generous. Some of us simply need to begin to train our hearts and minds on how to be generous. But you can't wait till you say, I'm going to do this when I'm older. I'm going to do this when I'm wealthier. I'm going to do this when things are more convenient. I'm going to do this when I have more time and all the kids are out of the house. You see, because here's the truth. If you can't learn it now, you won't learn it then. If we can't be willing to hear a sermon on generosity and say, yeah, there's work in my own life that needs to happen now, you won't say, well, someday, Pastor Todd, preach this again in 4 or 5 years, and I'll do it then. One of the interesting things about this idea of generous grace is really what is truly generous is only known by the person who gives. What I mean by that is this. We might look at a number on a check, how many dollars it was. that we gave to somebody or we gave to the church and go, oh my gracious, now that was a generous gift. But how do we know? We only have perspective of which gifts are generous if we know all the surrounding financial realities of the person who gave, and we don't tend to know that about everybody else. In other words, it is between God and us whether or not how we give of our lives and our money and our time is generous. Only God really knows whether or not we are generous that way. But isn't that the way you want it? Isn't it God, ultimately, that we are longing that He would be pleased with how we live our lives? He's the one who's poured out the grace on us. You know, it's interesting when you get to the end of the book of Ruth. People say to Naomi, no one's calling her Mara. Because you know what happens? Some of you have heard this chain, and we're not going to spend a lot of time on it tonight, but what happens is Ruth and Boaz do get married, and they have a baby. And Mara goes back to being Naomi because she goes from a heart of bitterness to the holder of babies. She gets to be grandma. She gets to be grandma to a little guy named Obed, who grows up, has a son named Jesse, who grows up and has a son named David, who becomes the king of Israel. And Ruth never knew. Ruth never saw down the line that if she would just be faithful and generous with grace, God would bless her back so many times over. She would go to her grave saying, you can't outgive God. Watch what He does. Tonight I just want us to bow our heads. No long, drawn-out, protracted close this evening, but just an opportunity to possibly confess before God this statement: I am not as generous as I want to be. I'm just going to be real transparent with you. This is real life. I'm praying that prayer personally tonight. I am saying to God right now, God, I am not as generous as I want to be. And Lord, I want you to develop a generous heart in me. I want to be more caring. I want to see others. I spend too many hours in my day just seeing myself. Lord, I want to serve others. I want to bear others' burdens. So God, tonight in this room, for those of us who are crying that out to you, would you just work a work in us? That we will leave here tonight one notch more generous than we came. And begin, God, to do that work in us. So that our soul becomes more and more like you, and you'll just kind of set our heart ablaze with you, with the joy of what it's like to really live not only under generous grace, but providing generous grace. And we'll give you praise, I ask in Jesus' name. Amen.